I was observing a close friend of mine recently. Let's call her Sarah. And on the surface, she is the absolute archetype of the successful modern woman. I mean, she balances this demanding career. She's raising 2 kids, and she's also managing the care for her aging parents. We were at a gathering the other day, and she was just a blur of constant, efficient motion. Refilling drinks, soothing a crying toddler, laughing at her husband's jokes, making sure every single person there was comfortable. Her husband even raised a toast to her, joking that she's the, quote, glue that holds the world together. But then I got a glimpse of her in the kitchen when she thought she was alone. She was just staring blankly at a pile of dishes, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles were white. And the smile, it was just gone. It was replaced not by sadness, but by this terrifying emptiness. She wasn't just physically tired. She looked completely hollowed out. It wasn't the look of someone who needs a vacation. It was the look of a person running entirely on a cortisol-fueled survival mode. And when she noticed me, she didn't vent or ask for help. She immediately snapped the mask back on, flinched with guilt, and apologized for being antisocial. That split-second transition from the perfect nurturing caretaker to a woman on the brink of total internal collapse was, well, it was chilling. It perfectly illustrated this brutal reality that we rarely discuss honestly. Society has conditioned women to view self-sacrifice as a virtue and self-preservation as a moral failing. We're looking at a dynamic where women are biologically wired for a negativity bias to ensure survival, yet they're culturally trained to ignore their own minds until they fracture. Sarah wasn't suffering from a bad day. She was suffering from a life where her own thoughts were no longer hers. And this isn't just about stress. This is about a lack of cognitive engineering.
That image, that terrifying emptiness replacing the efficient mask. That's exactly where we need to start this deep dive. You're hitting on a core tension where these huge sociocultural expectations clash and clash violently with neurobiological realities. We're investigating a scenario where a person is literally fracturing internally because the external system demands constant selfless output. So our mission today is, I think, critically important, and it's twofold. First, we have to acknowledge the severity and the specificity of this pressure, the conditioning, the unique neurobiological vulnerabilities women face, particularly around accumulated stress and trauma. Second, and this is the hopeful part, we're going to explore specific evidence-based forms of what you call cognitive engineering, things that can effectively rewire the brain to foster resilience, self-empowerment, and really the capacity to see self-preservation as a primary virtue.
Okay, so let's unpack that weight they carry. Because Sarah's story, it's so common. Women are constantly juggling these multiple, incredibly demanding roles. They're mothers, they're workers, spouses, and in so many households, they are the primary, often unpaid caregivers for aging parents or other family members.
And that load isn't static. It only intensifies, often dramatically, when a major crisis hits, whether it's something global like a pandemic or something personal like a sudden financial downturn. And if we step back and look at the sociocultural factors globally, the evidence shows these systems actively contribute to impaired mental health.
How does that look in practice, though? Are we talking about like explicit bias, or is it something more insidious?
It's often systemic, and insidious is the right word. We're dealing with these deeply ingrained, unequal power dynamics between males and females, in economic and political spheres. We see social norms that frequently dictate these really restrictive roles, which then translate to lower levels of education or fewer opportunities for paid employment, even in modern Western societies. This focus, which is often entirely on women's reproductive and family roles, it's socially restrictive. It can lead to a kind of internal suffocation.
It sounds like society is limiting the external world available to women and then forcing them to focus all their energy inward onto the family unit. If your environment constantly limits your choices and focuses you purely on serving others, how do you hold on to your own sense of self, your own trajectory?
That's the critical link to mental health. These socially constructed limitations, these external barriers to advancing and accomplishing personal goals, they don't just cause frustration, they worsen mental health outcomes significantly. When women experience these constraints, they tend to report a greater degree of negative emotional influences, a lower perceived level of self-confidence, and maybe most critically, diminished aspirations for progress and personal advancement. They are, in effect, conditioned to shrink their inner world, their ambitions, their dreams, to fit these external, restrictive, and demanding roles.
And the ultimate result of that is the terrifying emptiness we saw in Sarah, that feeling of being hollowed out. So if the outside world is trying to shrink you, the solution has to come from establishing, massive internal territory, reclaiming autonomy over your own development.
And that brings us directly to this fascinating and deeply studied concept in psychological research, personal growth initiative, or PGI. PGI is absolutely central to self-development and to mental health. It basically represents an individual's desire for autonomy and their active, purposeful involvement in self-improvement. It's the core mechanism of intentional, self-directed change.
So it's not just some fuzzy goal. It sounds like something that can be measured, tracked, and actively built.
It can. The beauty of the PGI concept is that it isn't vague at all. It's broken down into 4 specific actionable dimensions that are the components of intentional growth. We can really see them as the building blocks of resilience and self-direction.
Lay out the architecture for us. How does someone actively do PGI?
Well, the first dimension is planning for growth. And this involves setting realistic, tangible goals for self-improvement. It's moving beyond just wishing things were better. The second is taking conscious actions toward those goals, the actual behavioral steps you take. The third is preparation for change. This one's crucial because it accounts for readiness. It acknowledges that growth isn't comfortable. It often involves struggle, setback, emotional pain. You have to be ready for that discomfort.
And the fourth dimension.
The fourth is the effective use of resources available to them. And this could mean leveraging social support, seeking professional help, reading books, finding training. What's crucial to understand here is that true personal growth and the stability PGI provides. It happens when individuals are deeply involved in their own therapeutic or developmental process. It requires both cognitive elements like readiness for change and goal setting, and behavioral elements, which is the actual use of external resources and intentional action.
I see. So it's not just abstractly wishing to be better. It's architecting the actual process of self-improvement, using both your mind, the planning, the readiness, and your actions like conscious steps and using resources. I can imagine that having this initiative, this fierce drive for autonomy and self-improvement, would serve as a really powerful internal shield against that external pressure you described.
It serves as the ultimate firewall. Research overwhelmingly confirms a positive relationship between PGI and general well-being, while at the same time showing a negative association with crippling depression and psychological distress.
If we connect this back to Sarah's situation, PGI offers the pathway out of those diminished aspirations and that low self-confidence caused by constantly prioritizing others. It is the active architectural rejection of the idea that self-preservation is a moral failing and the embrace of self-directed, purposeful change. That sounds incredibly empowering, but we have to acknowledge the starting point for so many women like Sarah. If a person is already hollowed out, dealing with chronic stress or past trauma, the first challenge isn't growth. It's often just surviving the day. We need to shift now to the deepest cost of this environment, the precise neurobiological reality of trauma in the female brain.
And this is where we confront the hard data, the specific sex-linked vulnerabilities. We know that females are statistically twice as likely as males to meet diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And this dramatic difference, it emphasizes the critical need to understand the sex-specific neurobiological substrates that make women disproportionately vulnerable to developing this debilitating disorder, even when you control for the types of trauma exposure.
Where do we see the deepest cuts in the brain structure? I suspect the trauma timing is a massive factor here, especially when you think about the developmental stage of the brain.
Absolutely. Trauma timing, its type, its duration, all of it severely impacts neurodevelopment. The research overwhelmingly indicates that trauma occurring early in childhood is the most detrimental. It profoundly modifies the naturally occurring development and organization of the brain's structures. It essentially sets the brain on a different trajectory, which makes subsequent self-regulation that much more challenging.
And what are the measurable structural results of that early damage? Let's look at the long-term impact of something like childhood sexual abuse, or CSA, which the sources highlight as having specific neural consequences.
We see distinct structural and functional outcomes that affect core cognitive machinery. For adolescent females with PTSD who experience CSA, there is compromised BOLD activity, that stands for blood oxygen level dependent signal. Think of BOLD activity as the brain's energy meter. So compromised BOLD-D means diminished blood flow linked to neural activity, which indicates that key regions are running on low power. And this compromised activity is particularly noted within the frontoparietal network, or FPN.
Okay, can you break down what the FPN does for us? Why is that such a high-stakes region of the brain?
Think of the FPN as the brain's chief executive officer. It handles the highest level of thinking. It's responsible for executive functioning, which includes planning, complex decision-making, controlling impulses, switching between tasks. So when we say there's compromised Boldi activity and sometimes even increased cortical thickness, which suggests a kind of struggling overdevelopment in that network, it means the CEO's office is chronically running on half power. It makes planning, focusing, and coping with cognitive load fundamentally harder.
So even in adolescence, their core machinery for planning and complex thought is already struggling because of this developmental trauma. What happens as these survivors mature into adulthood? Does the brain ever fully recover or compensate?
Well, the deficits become protracted. They get more deeply embedded. For adults who experienced early trauma, specifically before the age of 12, we see clear evidence of decreased gray matter volume, or GMV, in several critical areas. This includes the visual cortex, the right basolateral and cortical amygdala, and a smaller splenium of the corpus callosum.
That is a collection of deficits that sounds like a recipe for a life of constant internal friction. Let's focus on the functional consequences. Decreased volume in the amygdala, for example, the brain's primary fear center. What does that translate to in daily life?
It translates to profound, protracted challenges. Reduced amygdala volume, especially when combined with other issues, suggests an altered fear response, sometimes becoming overly active and reactive, and sometimes showing blunted emotional responses. The reduced visual cortex volume means difficulty with visual memory. And the smaller splenium of the corpus callosum suggests communication deficits between the two brain hemispheres, particularly for rapidly shifting attention and processing visual information. Essentially, the neural structures that you need to integrate complex information, regulate fear, and successfully shift context. They are physically altered by that early trauma.
It's not just a memory issue then. It's a fundamental processing issue that affects how the entire environment is perceived and navigated. Okay, moving from childhood trauma to adult trauma, the sources specify intimate partner violence, IPV, and sexual assault, SA, as having unique neurobiological correlates in women too.
They absolutely do. And we see aberrations across major interacting neural networks, the frontoparietal network we just discussed, the default mode network, which handles self-referential thought and internal reflection, and the salience network, which detects and filters important internal and external stimuli.
When those networks are thrown into disarray in IPV-related PTSD, what is the result for the person? What does that feel like?
Clinically, it translates to profound difficulty with emotional regulation and a state of chronic, exhausting hypervigilance. If we look at the brain regions, within-group comparisons show divergence in activity in the amygdala, the insula, which is our seat of internal bodily awareness, and the prefrontal cortices.
What's this specific, complicated pattern of activity researchers are finding in these regions?
Yeah, it's contradictory, which suggests a system under immense strain. We see this strong tendency toward hypoactivation of the frontal and parietal lobes when neural activation is typically required. It's like the logical control centers go dark or into an energy-saving mode. And this may directly relate to common PTSD symptoms like avoidance, emotional numbness, or dissociation. But at the same time, there is hyperactivity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Wait, hyperactivity in the parts meant for focused effort and integrating information, but hypoactivity in the parts meant for core cognitive engagement. That sounds backwards.
Exactly. It suggests a significant difficulty in integrating contextual information into emotional responses. The higher-level frontal regions are trying desperately to focus, integrate, and apply top-down control, but the foundational systems are struggling with modulation. The brain is constantly spinning its wheels without translating that intense cognitive effort into effective, calming action.
Okay, now compare that fraught profile to the one found in survivors of sexual assault and PTSD, but this is similar.
It's similar but distinct. The SA-PTSD profile presents a composite of hyperactivity and structural change. We find hyperactivity in the insula and the prefrontal cortex, combined with aberrant gray matter volume in the amygdala, the right caudate, and the insula. And this composite leads to chronic difficulties in processing information related to self and others, along with severe hyperarousal, that constant state of being on edge. Ultimately, both forms of trauma result in a compromised ability to manage arousal in the amygdala and insula. This weakens executive, cognitive, and social functioning, and it often necessitates greater inefficient activation of the prefrontal cortex in a desperate attempt at top-down control.
This overwhelming state of compromised control and chronic hypervigilance. It leads us to another vulnerability factor that is inherently sex-specific and often just, drastically overlooked in general trauma discussions: the powerful role of the neuroendocrine system.
This is a critical point. The brain does not operate in a vacuum. It is constantly bathed in hormones. Fluctuations in estradiol and progesterone throughout the menstrual cycle directly influence brain volume and function. And why? Because the amygdala and the hippocampus, the very centers of fear processing, memory, and emotional regulation, have an incredibly high density of receptors for these specific sex hormones.
So the hormones aren't just affecting mood or bodily function, they are physically influencing the excitability and the plasticity of the core fear circuitry, the actual volume and capacity of those regions.
Precisely. These hormonal fluctuations can and do increase the frequency and severity of PTSD symptoms. For instance, women may experience heightened memory difficulty, more intense re-experiencing of intrusive thoughts, and negative alterations in mood, all correlating with different phases of their cycle.
And this is where it gets really interesting for treatment. The sources highlight how estradiol levels affect fear extinction. What does that mean for trauma recovery?
It's a huge finding with massive clinical implications. So fear extinction is the process of learning that a previously feared stimulus is now safe. It's the core mechanism that exposure therapy relies on. Low levels of estradiol have specifically been found to negatively predict the ability to habituate to fear extinction among those with PTSD. In other words, when estradiol is low, the brain's ability to learn to let go of fear is diminished.
Wow. So that means the timing of a trauma or even the timing of treatment relative to the phase of the menstrual cycle, it can effectively act as a biological risk factor. It could influence whether someone can successfully learn to overcome that fear response.
It absolutely does. It underscores the menstrual cycle phase as a critical modulator of risk and resilience. It also helps explain why treatment outcomes, especially those relying on extinction learning like exposure therapy, can be notoriously variable and difficult to predict in female patients. If a patient enters treatment when her estradiol levels are low, her brain may simply be less receptive to the crucial learning needed to extinguish that fear.
That just put such a fine point on the unique complexity of the female neurobiology under stress. So, beyond external trauma and internal hormonal shifts, let's look at the ingrained cognitive habits that women often develop, especially under chronic stress. The sources suggest that negative coping styles like rumination and neuroticism are also literally wired into the neural structure of the PTSD brain.
They are not just mental habits, they are powerful, measurable modulators of neurobiological presentation. If we look at emotional dysregulation in females with PTSD, we often see that classic structural pattern we touched on earlier: hypoactivity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC, and hyperactivity in the amygdala.
Remind us of the VMPFC's function again.
The VMPFC is essentially the brain's brake pedal for arousal. Its job is to detect safety and send calming signals to the amygdala. When it's underactive, it results in a profound difficulty downregulating emotional and physiological arousal. The brake simply isn't working effectively, and the fear center is constantly running hot.
And rumination is the cognitive loop that keeps the wound fresh. That constant repetitive replay of negative events or self-blame, which is so common for women conditioned to self-sacrifice. How does the brain encode that specific negative coping style?
Well, research shows that rumination is physically correlated with hyperconnectivity. Too much signaling between the right amygdala and several midline structures, including the medial prefrontal cortex, MPFC, and the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC.
What's the functional consequence of that hyperconnectivity? What does that do?
It reflects the increased, exhausting cognitive effort required to simply shift attention sets away from negatively valenced information. If you're constantly fixated on negative information, the parts of your brain responsible for focus and integration are overworking to feed that negative loop. Rumination is also correlated with increased GMV, increased size, in the left isthmus cingulate, further linking this damaging behavioral mechanism to specific structural changes in the brain that reinforce the habit.
So the brain is actively building architecture to support the exhausting process of rumination. That speaks to its incredible plasticity, but here it's working against the person. What about neuroticism, the trait linked to generalized psychopathology and heightened negative emotion?
Neuroticism, as a personality trait, is linked to chronic hyperactivation in the amygdala and the right prefrontal cortex. Functionally, this state of chronic hyperarousal interferes with the objective, rational evaluation of environmental stimuli. The The brain defaults to a state of perceived threat, leading to an overprocessing of fear, often when none exists in reality. It's like the brain's threat scanner is permanently set to maximum sensitivity.
Okay, so we've established the enormous external burden and the precise internal cost. A brain physically and functionally altered by early trauma, prone to instability from hormonal shifts, and then cemented in negative coping styles like rumination. It sounds overwhelming and, frankly, locked in.
It sounds locked in, but the crucial takeaway from all this complexity is that the brain is plastic. If it can be wired for rumination, it can be engineered for resilience.
Exactly. The premise of this deep dive is cognitive engineering. We have to look at how we can actively force the brain to heal and rewire itself. Let's look at how we counteract that negative wiring. Let's move now to our first engineering strategy, the social and neural power of gratitude and synchronization.
This is where we see that simple, positive emotions have far-reaching effects.
Right.
Gratitude specifically is not just about feeling good. It serves critical adaptive functions, motivating moral behavior, driving stable cooperation, and stabilizing relationships in a way that transcends simple transactional reciprocity. It's recognized as a moral barometer that widely motivates long-term cooperative tendencies.
So you're saying gratitude is an evolutionary mechanism for building durable social structures, not just a mood boost.
That's precisely it. It's a mechanism for collective stability. And we can see this engineering in action because the research used FNIRS hyperscanning, which is one of the most powerful tools available today. It allows researchers to simultaneously measure inner brain synchronization, or IBS, between two people while they interact.
Inner brain synchronization. That sounds technical. What is it functionally?
Think of it as neural synchrony. It measures when two brains are dancing together, having coordinated and correlated activity patterns in specific regions at the same time. It's a biological marker of effective shared cognitive control and social understanding.
Tell us about the setup of this social experiment. How did they test the resilience of gratitude?
The study involved 83 female dyads, so two women interacting who are strangers, to control for prior familiarity. They were randomly assigned to one of three emotional induction groups: gratitude, joy, or neutral emotions. And crucially, they participated in two very different types of cooperation tasks to see if gratitude's stabilizing effect held up under different pressures.
Okay, let's look at those two tasks. What do they measure?
First, the costly cooperation task, which was a classic iterated prisoner's dilemma game, or PDG. In this game, cooperating yields less immediate personal gain than defecting, but if both defect, the loss is maximized for both. It's a pure test of trust and the durability of cooperation under the pressure of self-interest.
That's the classic test where rational self-interest usually leads to a breakdown in cooperation over time.
Exactly. The second task was the costless coordination task, known as the button press game, or BPG. This one is purely about efficiency and coordination. Participants had to press a button simultaneously to earn a point. Critically, they received feedback on whether they were faster or slower than their partner on the previous trial. This forced them to learn and implement effective adjustment to synchronize better.
So PDG tests trust durability under risk, and BPG tests cooperative efficiency under cognitive pressure and forced behavioral adaptation. What did gratitude do in the risky, costly cooperation environment?
The results are striking, especially regarding stability over time. The game was played in blocks. In the joy and neutral groups, mutual cooperation saw a significant and expected decrease in the second block of a game, while defection increased. People just got less cooperative when it was costly, and the risk of being exploited grew. However, the gratitude group maintained a stable, high rate of mutual cooperation across both blocks.
Wow. So gratitude inoculated them against the typical rational erosion of trust and cooperation that comes with self-interest. It stabilized the partnership.
It did, suggesting a shift in strategic behavior. And the participants themselves recognized this. The self-report rating of expressed gratitude was significantly and positively correlated with mutual cooperation, specifically in Block 2, suggesting that the induced feeling of gratitude was actively driving the behavior and stabilizing cooperation when the temptation to defect was strongest.
That demonstrates durability in costly interactions. Now, what about the costless coordination game, where it was purely about efficiency, synchronization, and that effective adjustment?
Here, gratitude boosted the brain's ability to coordinate actions. The gratitude group showed a significantly higher effective adjustment rate and mean cooperation rate compared to the neutral group in the second block. That effective adjustment rate is key. It means they were more willing and able to successfully adjust their response speed based on the feedback from the previous trial to synchronize better with their partner. They learned faster.
That effective adjustment metric seems directly relevant to social resilience in real life. The ability to pivot and coordinate actions quickly in a crisis, like two parents working together during a child's emergency.
It is. The gratitude group reported higher satisfaction with their own performance and higher perceived cooperativeness in their diet. The study authors interpret this as clear evidence of a stronger sense of joint agency, meaning they felt more effective working together as a single unit.
And this brings us back to that crucial question. Is gratitude just a positive feeling, or is it a specific engineering tool?
It is a specific tool. The results clearly differentiate it from mere happiness. The researchers took great care to compare the joy group with the gratitude group. While joy is also a positive emotion, the joy group did not perform as well as the gratitude group when it came to stabilizing costly cooperation in the PDG. So joy might make you feel good, but gratitude is the mechanism that stabilizes trust under risk. This differentiates gratitude as a unique, powerful, and stabilizing mechanism for social interaction.
This is where we link the behavior back to the hardwiring. How did this improved cooperation and adjustment show up in the interbrain synchronization data? Did their brains literally start synchronizing better?
They absolutely did. Gratitude significantly enhanced widespread social cooperation and, fundamentally, enhanced inner brain synchronization among individuals. Specifically, in the BPG, the pure coordination task, the gratitude group showed significantly larger IBS in multiple brain clusters in the second block. This reflects an increase in synchronous neural activity over time as they learned and worked together.
And functionally, what does that increased synchronization do?
The increased IBS acts as a direct marker of enhanced cognitive control for coordinating behaviors. In this case, it reflected a stronger motivation for the autonomous modulation of concrete actions, like adjusting those button press speeds. Their brains were aligning to better anticipate and respond to their partner's rhythm.
The synchronization finding is profound because it shows the dynamic nature of the effect. Cooperation wasn't higher at the start. It increased and became stable over time, mirroring the stability seen in the behavioral data. Was there a specific neural overlap that signaled a core, common mechanism of social cooperation, regardless of whether the task was costly or costless?
Yes, there was a crucial overlap, identifying the brain regions most vital for collaboration. The right middle frontal gyrus and the right supramarginal gyrus showed significant task-related IBS across both the costly prisoner's dilemma game and the costless button press game.
What are those regions responsible for, and why does their synchronization matter so much for cooperation?
Well, the right middle frontal gyrus is heavily involved in executive functioning, cognitive control, and decision-making. It's part of that FPN we discussed earlier that is often running on low power in trauma survivors. And the right supramarginal gyrus is crucial for attention shifting, social cognition, and integrating sensory information about others. When these two areas synchronize, it suggests a foundation for guided, effective social cooperation.
So when Sarah puts on that mask and efficiently manages the party, she's burning energy in those exact frontal areas. But when she practices gratitude, she's actually strengthening the connections between her own focus and her social awareness. It makes that cooperation less draining over time because the underlying networks are working in tandem.
That's the key synthesis. Gratitude is an incredibly direct form of cognitive engineering. It targets the neural networks responsible for executive function and synchronization, strengthening them when they are most needed in a partnership, and effectively rewiring the impulse for collaboration and efficiency to be internally durable rather than externally draining.
Okay, so if gratitude is fast-acting synchronization, let's pivot now to our second strategy, which looks at durability over the long haul. We have a follow-up study that tracked women years after they participated in personal development groups, or PDGs. This strategy seems to be about building long-term, structural, durable support systems to cultivate that personal growth initiative.
That's a perfect framing. This research specifically evaluated women 6 years after they completed personal development groups focused on building personal and social skills. They were asked to reflect on the long-term efficacy of that intense group experience, especially when faced with major unexpected crises.
6 years is a proper stress test. What were the most durable self-perceptions that emerged, the ones that lasted over half a decade?
The primary, most resonant impact was a positive, long-lasting elevation of self-esteem and self-confidence. They moved away from the external validation that defined Sarah's life and toward an internal sense of worth. One participant captured this perfectly, saying, Everything we do is based on our positive perception of ourselves. We learn to trust ourselves first.
That quote right there is the antidote to the Sarah archetype, who defines her worth purely by her sacrifice for others. The group helped them build internal security.
Exactly. The group experience was described as a source of emotional and psychological security, and this security enabled them to trust not only themselves but other people too. They learned to avoid seeing adversaries wherever, which is a sign that the neuroticism and hypervigilance we discussed earlier were being actively unwired.
Beyond self-confidence, how did the group address the emotional dysregulation we discussed? The hyperactivity in the amygdala and the hypoactivity in the brain's brake pedal, the VMPFC.
The intervention served as a crucial bridge. It allowed women to come in touch with, recognize, and crucially regulate their intense feelings. Many admitted they were previously secretive, suppressing their emotions or being ashamed of expressing them, believing that expressed emotion was a sign of failing their multiple roles. The group taught them a measure of control. One participant noted the massive shift, saying, "I was going too far. I put a measure now. I found the rules. I learned to keep in touch with my feelings." They acquired emotional literacy, the ability to identify and moderate the intensity of their internal experience and communicate it outwards, moving from being rather secretive to expressing emotions and learning how to act out and communicate them constructively.
That structural change, from secrecy to expression and moderation, is a direct counter to the internal chaos caused by trauma and rumination. What therapeutic techniques in the PDGs were most instrumental in achieving this deep self-awareness?
The groups used expressive techniques like guided visualization, guided imagination, and art therapy. These methods weren't about superficial fixes. They were designed to help women contact the deeper, less known, and processed depths of their inner self. This healing process fostered greater self-awareness and integrated previously suppressed or traumatic emotional material. It gave them an internal map of their own territory.
A 6-year window, especially spanning the intense uncertainty and isolation of the COVID-19 health crisis and the preceding global financial crisis. I mean, that is the ultimate stress test for resilience. Did these engineered coping skills hold up under real-world pressure?
The durability was remarkable and provides powerful data on the lasting effect of PGI. They developed crucial stress management skills, learning to set priorities, organize tasks efficiently, and cope under sustained pressure. This is a direct implementation of the PGI planning and action dimensions.
And what was the specific impact during the extreme stress and anxiety of the COVID-19 pandemic when global chaos and social isolation were at their peak?
The participants reported consciously utilizing the coping mechanisms discussed and practiced in the group to manage their extreme stress and anxiety. They exhibited remarkable self-efficacy and composure, framed by the confidence that they had a structure for survival. One woman stated, "Although I was afraid, I was able to control it now that I had a team," meaning the group's shared knowledge and support. "The processes were familiar to me." Another noted, "Without the group, I'm not sure what I would do."
That is such a powerful takeaway. It shows us that discipline isn't about crushing your feelings. It's about actively redesigning your environment and your behavior to support the resilience you're trying to build.
And a critical element of their long-term resilience was their ability to reframe the crisis itself. Instead of viewing the financial crisis or the pandemic as a catastrophe or a reason for despair, they actively reframed it as a challenge or a chance to reflect, reorganize, and begin over. This highly developed cognitive control, this ability to reinterpret negative events, led to new ways of behaving and, importantly, finding what they called collective hope.
Reframing catastrophe is a chance for positive internal change. That sounds like highly developed executive function overcoming the negativity bias. What were some of the practical coping strategies they used day-to-day during the isolation of the pandemic?
They focused heavily on imposing structure to combat loneliness, boredom, and work-related stress. They reported rigidly following timetables, which gave them a sense of control amidst chaos. They transformed feelings of loneliness and isolation into action and creation, like advancing job-related tasks or starting new creative projects. They also actively utilized technology to stay connected with friends and family, sharing moments over video calls, transforming isolation into community. They actively engineered their environment to support their mental health.
I find the language they use to describe the long-term impact especially powerful. We often talk about therapy outcomes using clinical metrics, but these women use vivid imagery and metaphors. What were some of the metaphors they used to describe this lasting change years later?
Their images conveyed a sense of continuous improvement, power, and stable, supportive caregiving for themselves and for others. One participant described the process as a difficult road, but it is filled with very beautiful roses. Their smelling enables me to keep walking, signifying that growth requires continuous effort, but the benefits sustain the journey. Another described the group itself as a nest with newborn chicks, a second family for me, signifying stable support and an environment that enabled them to nurture themselves first, which in turn allowed them to better take care of their real families.
That continuous development, the road filled with roses, the perpetually available nest, shows that the cognitive engineering process instilled in them an ongoing, self-sustaining personal growth initiative. It wasn't a one-time fix.
And the longevity of the impact, the fact that this resilience held up 6 years later during 2 major global crises, provides powerful evidence that these personal development groups offer a necessary, durable tool for women's empowerment and stable mental health in the face of adversity. The engineering strategy fundamentally worked.
So if we synthesize this entire journey, we started with that chilling observation of Sarah, the efficient mass-concealing total internal collapse driven by a deep conflict between cultural expectations and the need for self-preservation. And we end with the scientific evidence for self-remediation, proving that the brain can be successfully engineered away from that destructive path.
The evidence is undeniably clear. The high, disproportionate rates of PTSD and distress in females stem from a terrible nexus. Exposure to specific gendered trauma, unique neurobiological vulnerabilities modulated by hormonal fluctuations, and entrenched negative coping styles like rumination that are reinforced by societal messaging that values self-sacrifice over self-preservation.
But the flip side of that complexity is the brain's profound plasticity. We've just reviewed 2 distinct, powerful, and evidence-based ways that resilience can be actively engineered and implemented.
We saw the effectiveness of strategy 1. The intentional cultivation of gratitude. Gratitude is not superficial. It has a quantifiable, direct, and synchronizing effect on neural networks, specifically the right middle frontal gyrus and the supramarginal gyrus. It directly strengthens the systems of cognitive control and attention shifting that are crucial for successful cooperation, stabilizing partnerships even when trust is risky, and making joint action less draining.
And strategy 2 offered the long-term structural behavioral solution to build internal autonomy.
Yes. The long-term structured support systems like personal development groups demonstrate that cultivating self-confidence, drastically improving emotional management and literacy, and achieving self-efficacy allows women to fundamentally change their internal narrative. They learn to actively reframe catastrophe as a challenge, proving that intentional cognitive and behavioral elements are the durable basis of personal growth initiative. These strategies, working together, offer the necessary tools for women to develop self-preservation as a primary, non-negotiable virtue, leading to stable, durable mental health that serves them, rather than simply serving the demands of others.